Akwai, greetings. Natia Wisong Swamatai Mutahash. My name is Chief Many Hearts Lynn Malerba of the Mohegan Tribe, and I thank the Foundation Brochure, the University of Melbourne, and all the conference organizers for asking me to speak today and kindly inviting me to offer some comments. Songskwa means rock woman or chief in our language, and Mutawi Mutahash means many hearts. In the past, I was a critical care nurse and my specialty was cardiology. When I became chief, our medicine woman bestowed this name upon me, stating that you have cared for many hearts in the past, and now you care for our hearts as the chief. And so this is a name that I proudly carry with me forward. I follow in the footsteps of my great-grandfather, Chief Mataga, and my mother, Loretta Roberge, who was on our tribal council and was a tribal leader for over 30 years. So now I'm going to share my screen with you and offer some comments. So I am pleased to offer policy considerations for tribal nations and researchers who are engaged in epigenetic studies. I shared this map with you. This is a map of Connecticut, and I know it's a bit hard to see, but it's in the 1600s, and all of the place names are indigenous. And that is because that all of these lands were inhabited by the indigenous people of Connecticut. Once we encountered the immigrants who came to our shores, we lost 90% of our population, and 90% of our lands were taken from us between the early 1600s and the mid 1700s. Now, we have always had continued unbroken government, regardless of the immigrants who came to our shores. And, you know, our diplomatic relations were initially with Europe prior to the formulation of the United States. Our unbroken tribal sovereignty and the exercise of that tribal sovereignty is extremely important to us. And so my remarks today will be in that context. We expect that the United States government and all of the agencies that it controls will engage with us as a sovereign nation and will consult with us as a sovereign nation, and that they will do so within the realm of the trust and treaty obligations of the United States. So this next slide is what happened. Medieval Europe used the doctrine of discovery to assert that the lands in the New World were vacant and available for ownership by the first Christian nation to settle these lands, and that if they did encounter any people here, that they were to live in servitude to the people who then we encountered. This was the basis for the United States, what they believed to be their sovereign right to extinguish the native people's right of occupancy. Now, this photo is a photo of my great-grandfather, Chief Mataga. And one of the things we need to think about here is, are native genetics something for others to lay claim to? You know, does genetic testing inform non-native people about our communities and our cultures? Are we perpetuating cultural harm, which would harm the ability of tribes to exist in the future? Blood quantum is a colonial construct. And, you know, and what it tries to do is to tell tribes who should be a tribal member and who is not allowed to be a tribal member. Well, who gets to decide that? Now, we believe that tribes get to determine their citizenship, their citizens, just as any other nation does. And, you know, we believe that our tribes are not just created by blood relations. They're a very intricate relationship of culture, place, political relations, and social relations. And we engage with the federal government on a nation-to-nation basis. The Indian Reorganization Act in 1934 talked a little bit about that, and they found that there were deplorable conditions in Indian country. And so this act was designed to help reestablish and restore tribes to their previous sovereignty. But what they tried to do with the Bureau of Indian Affairs is to determine for us who would be a tribal citizen and who would not. And so the Commissioner Collier of the Bureau of Indian Affairs said, well, I think it should be 25% blood quantum to be considered an Indian. And the Senate Indian Affairs Committee Chairman Wheeler, said, no, I think it should be 50%. We're trying to get rid of the Indian problem, not create more. So that was the context that the United States was was operating under, they really thought that tribes would disappear and the Indian people would disappear and they no longer have any obligation to us within the trust and treaty obligations. But our Indigenous people ceded almost 100% of the land, 97% of land in the United States to the United States. And today, the riches that the United States receives from that land, it is in the realm of $20 billion a year. And so we believe that the United States needs to live up to its promise to take care of us and to live up to the trust and treaty obligations that they so long ago promised. So as we think about studies and as we think about genetic studies, we need to ensure that all of the agencies that are participating in this respect our tribal sovereignty and that they consult with us. They are required to consult with us via presidential executive orders. And as you see here, consultation is more than just listening. It's really getting to the point of agreement to really discuss an issue, to understand the policy impacts on Native tribes, and to get to consent from the tribes to agree to a particular policy that an agency wants to follow. Once we agree on a policy and we think that it should be implemented, there still needs to be ongoing evaluation and revision because there could be unintended consequences. And we want to make sure that anything that we agree to is working as agreed upon. So here are some of the policy considerations that we believe are important for genomic studies and Native population. We need to think about, consent. What does consent mean? Does consent of an individual tribal member equal the consent of the tribe? Well, absolutely not. And what are the risks and benefits for tribal communities? There have been some very stigmatizing studies that tribal communities did not even agree to participate in, but instead were undertaken and then the results were shared, despite the tribes being unaware that those studies had occurred. And a very prominent one was the Havasupai tribe who participated in genetic studies to address an epidemic of diabetes, and yet only to find that their genetics were used for other studies that were very stigmatizing. So how do we get to data sovereignty? We need to have data use and sharing agreements. Who owns the data? How does the data get published? Do the tribes have an ability to influence how and when and what gets published about them? Who owns the intellectual property rights? And what are the cultural considerations for biosamples? Some tribes believe that biosamples need to be returned to them. Some tribes don't believe that biosamples should even be taken. But best practices are such that some tribes now own their biobanks and they're doing their own studies. I really think that that is something that we can replicate and should be used as best practices. What are the consent issues? And again, I talked a little bit about that. Tribal identification versus self-identification. Is recruitment on and off tribal lands okay? We know that many of our tribal citizens live off reservation, but yet they are still our enrolled citizen. Who gets to determine how recruitment is done? How do we look at incidental re-identification or disclosure with some of the smaller tribes like the Rancherias in the Southwest and some of the very small tribes in the East Coast and on the West Coast? If you have a very small population, it is very likely that there could be some re-identification. And what happens if there is a change of heart in the participant? Is that participant allowed to withdraw from the study? What happens to their biosample once they withdraw? Is there ceremony that should be considered around the return of that biosample or the destruction of that biosample? And what are the risks and benefits to our tribal community? In our tribe, we believe that we would only participate in research that has benefit to us. If there is a question that a researcher is trying to answer that really doesn't benefit to our community or our individuals, there really is no reason for us to do that if it is just research and academic inquiry. What about plant-based medicines? If there are unique pharmaceuticals that get created based on plant-based medicines, do tribes participate in the economy around that? And are they able to? And some tribes have very discrete practices, discrete healing practices that they would not want disclosed. and they are something that are unique to their tribes and are something that are held within confidence. Research in our eyes, is very important, but we need to make sure that as we think about research that we could take all of these issues into consideration. So what protections are offered for tribal communities? Who determines what studies are approved? Who approves the access to the database? These are all questions that we need to be thinking about. And there has been a lot of work around that. There has been a lot of publications and research done around that. I know that within the United States, there's the Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network that is really looking at these issues and educating our tribal communities about these issues as we think about how we might want to participate in research. Because again, we are not opposed to research. I think that tribes think very long and hard about research, but we also think that research should not be limited to just health. We think about research about cultural practices, land use, archaeological practices, historical and societal research. Those are all very important to us as well. And who has the intellectual property rights to this research? And I think we've chatted a little bit about that in the previous slide. So here are some cultural considerations that we should think about. The biobanking and best practices about that. Should every proposed tribal research require tribal researchers that are of every level? And I would argue that the answer to that is yes, particularly with the research access boards. We think that any research that is being proposed on these large genetic databases should have tribal citizens or tribal researchers at every level, so that we can ensure that this research is being done through a cultural lens, and people that are not part of tribal communities perhaps would overlook some of the nuances that are related to our cultural considerations. And that's why we believe it is very important that tribal researchers be very engaged at every level of research. So here is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and I'll give you a moment to take a look at it. But it does talk about control and protection and making sure that we are protecting our traditional knowledge, but also that we are acting in the best interests of our tribal nations, and that we are the ones that are in charge of that information and how we maintain it, how we control it, and how we develop intellectual properties around our cultural heritage and traditional knowledge and traditional cultural expressions. So we have some very have had some very promising conversations and consultations. The National Institute of Health, NIH, has a tribal health research office, and that office has a tribal advisory committee made of tribal leaders and as well as technical tribal experts. We have worked very hard to educate not only the Tribal Health Research Office, but the entire NIH on what is important to tribal nations and how we should look at research as we move forward. The All of Us work group is a work group that is looking at genetic studies, and the All of Us project wants to enroll 1 million people into this large data set that then can be used for research. And they actually developed a work group comprised of the All of Us researchers, the tribal researchers, and tribal leaders to talk about how best to structure outreach, enrollment, and tribal protections. And one of the things that I think is really important is that we've had ongoing consultations, and once we developed the premises and the philosophy and principles around the research for this project, then NIH went out and consulted with all of the tribal nations, which is exactly what should be happening. Once they did the consultation, held the consultations, then they revised some of their practices and protocols. And I think an important one was that there now is a frame or a way that tribal members who would like to participate in research, as they're signing up, there is one screen that they need to go through that talks a little bit about, does their tribe consent to being identified in tribal research? And if not, they surely can participate because it is their individual right to participate in research. but then they should not identify their tribe of origin unless the tribe expressly and explicitly consents to do so. So that's a way to protect the whole tribal community who perhaps would not want to be participating in this tribal or this research that all of us is conducting. And we also know that they are looking at adding Native people to the research advisory boards, and that is very important to us. Excuse me. Because we know that that is a way to ensure that there are cultural considerations that are looked at as researchers are developing their protocols and are developing their research proposals. And I just shared this last slide with you. Tribes are in a very unique situation in that we are responsible to our ancestors. They worked hard to ensure that we continue to exist in present day and that we were not considered relics of the past, that we do, in fact, still have a tribal government to engage with the United States government on a government-to-government, nation-to-nation responsibility. And then we are also responsible to those that we have yet to know. So Katap Tom Tumawish, thank you so very much for allowing me to participate in this lovely presentation and in this wonderful symposium.